Rome's story starts with myth and legend entwined with shards of historical reality, rather than with absolute accuracy. Roman mythology states that the deity Mars and a Vestal virgin called Rhea Silvia were the parents of twin brothers Romulus and Remus. A jealous monarch ordered these holy children to be drowned in the Tiber because he was afraid of them. They were transported gently downstream by the river, which may have known their fate and washed up on the eventual location of Rome. A shepherd by the name of Faustulus rescued and reared the abandoned children after a she-wolf found them there and fed them with her milk. As they developed into robust young men, they discovered their royal lineage and made the decision to found a new community on the riverbank where they had been rescued. However, the brothers argued. Romulus became the allmounder of the new city and murdered Remus in a tragedy that would reverberate throughout Roman history. In the year 753 BCE, which the Romans would later use to gauge their history, Romulus, standing atop what would become known as the Palatine Hill, delineated the limits of Rome with a plow. With Greek colonies to the south and more powerful Etruscan towns to the north, the early colony was hardly more than a group of thatched huts with a view of the Tiber. Romulus extended shelter to local refugees, exiles, and outlaws in an effort to fortify his fledgling town. The legendary occurrence known as the Rape of the Sabine Women, in which Romulus invited the neighboring Sabines to a feast and then kidnapped their girls to marry Roman males, resolved the issue of a lack of women. Following Romulus, Rome was governed by monarchs for around 250 years. A total of 7 kings oversaw the early city's growth, turning it from a hamlet into a major regional force. Numa Pompilius, who is regarded as a wise and devout leader, who founded many of Rome's religious customs and institutions, followed Romulus. In addition to establishing the Temple of Janus, which would only be closed during times of peace, a rare event in Roman history, he also created the post of Pontifex Maximus, the head priest. Tullus Hostilius, the third king, fought wars against Alba Longa, a neighbor, in order to increase Roman territory. Following their defeat, the Alban people was assimilated into Rome under his leadership, creating a pattern of absorption that would benefit Rome for the rest of its history. During this time, the Herasi and Curiati triplets who stood in for Rome and Alba Longa respectively engaged in the well-known fight that determined the destiny of both towns without resorting to full-scale conflict. The fourth king, Ancus Martius, established the port city of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber and built Rome's first bridge over the river, paving the way for trade lines that would later link Rome with the Mediterranean region. In order to effectively defend the expanding community, he also enlarged the city's borders to encompass the Janiculum Hill. Tarquinius Priscus, the fifth king, brought Etruscan influence to the Roman world. He started building the Circus Maximus for chariot racing and the massive Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. Under his leadership, the Cloaca Maxima's enormous draining project got underway, turning the marshy valley between the hills into the future Roman Forum. Rome's first constitution was put into effect by the sixth monarch, Servius Tullius, who divided the populace into classes according to their level of wealth and military might. For years to come, the Centuriate Assembly would continue to play a crucial role in Roman politics and military affairs. The renowned Seven Hills of Rome, the Palatine, the Aventine, the Capitoline, the Quirinal, the Viminal, the Esquiline, and the Caelian were all included in the original defensive wall that Servius built around the city. Tarquinius Superbus, often known as Tarquin the Proud, was the last monarch and a despot. The Temple of Jupiter was completed during his reign, among other great construction achievements, but the Roman nobles despised him for his brutality and conceit. His son, Sextus Tarquinius's rape of Lucretia, a respectable Roman noblewoman, was the tipping point. This indignation sparked a mutiny headed by Lucius Junius Brutus and Calatinus, Lucretia's husband. The monarchy was toppled in 509. The Roman Republic began when Tarquin and his family escaped into exile. In addition to influencing Rome's destiny, this new form of governance, which was intended to avoid the accumulation of power in one person, would have a lasting impact on political philosophy for millennia to come. We may see how Rome's early experiences influenced its character by reflecting on this formative era. Rome had incredible flexibility from the start, assimilating Greek and Etruscan ideas while forging her own unique personality. The roots of their subsequent empire were laid by the early Romans' traditions of practical engineering, military discipline, and legal order. The city, which started as a tiny collection of villages, expanded to encompass several communities spread over the 7 hills, linked by what would eventually become Rome's well-known streets. Though relatively little in comparison to what it would grow into, the city was one of the biggest in central Italy by the end of the monarchy, with a population of about 35,000. The family was the center of early Roman society, and the male head of the home, known as the pater familias, had almost total control over his dependents. Roman religious attendance was rigorous, since the city's prosperity depended on maintaining the pax deorum, or peace with the gods, through appropriate rites. Imagine these early Romans, farmers, soldiers, priests, and artisans, laying the foundation for the future everlasting city as you sink further into slumber. Rome would eventually expand its power across 3 continents and create an empire unlike any the world had ever seen, starting with modest beginnings on the banks of the Tiber. However, that expansion was not yet complete. For now, with the monarchs gone from history, Rome was at the beginning of its Republican period, prepared to set off on the course to glory that would immortalize its name. The populace stood at the start of a new era as the final Roman monarch retreated into exile, a daring experiment in government that would determine Rome's course for the next 5 centuries took the place of the monarchy that had steered the city's early development. The goal of the newly formed republic was to stop the consolidation of power that had resulted in Tarquinius Superbus's dictatorship. The king was replaced by 2 consuls, who were chosen every year and had the power to reject each other's judgments. Roman politics could not be controlled by a single individual according to this structure. The Senate, a council of elders from aristocratic families, was in charge of these consuls. Although it lacked official legislative authority, their opinion was highly valued. The existence of the early republic was immediately threatened. While the strong Etruscan lord Lars Porcina invaded Rome, the fugitive king looked for friends among nearby cities. Legend has it that a Roman warrior by the name of Horatius Cockles defended a bridge against the Etruscan army by himself. His companions then demolished the bridge behind him, preventing the city from being taken. Rome's internal political situation was just as difficult as her exterior adversaries. Initially, patricians, hereditary nobility, who held sway over both political and ecclesiastical institutions, dominated the republic. The vast mass of people, referred to as plebeians, were kept out of positions of authority and frequently forced into debt servitude for aristocratic landowners. Roman politics would be shaped for generations by this conflict between the orders. In the first known widespread strike in history, the plebeian soldiers who formed the core of Rome's military power retreated from the city to the Holy Hill, causing the first significant social crisis. Because of this extreme measure, patricians were compelled to establish the position of tribune of the plebs, which gave magistrates the power to veto laws that would be detrimental to the interests of the plebeian. Tribunes were deemed inviolable. Anyone who hurt them would be condemned by their religion and killed. The next big step was the writing of Rome's first written legal system, the 12 Tables. These statutes, which were posted publicly in the Forum, opened up previously opaque legal processes that were dominated by patricians. The 12 Tables created the idea that laws should be known to the public, which was a significant step toward more equality under the law, even if they still favored the elite in many ways. Rome progressively increased its power throughout central Italy as it overcame these internal issues. The city engaged in several conflicts with the Etruscans, the Volsci, the Aequi, and the Sabines, among other nearby peoples. Just 12 miles to the north, the Romans quadrupled their holdings when they conquered the prosperous Etruscan city of Veii. The Celtic Gauls' victory over the Roman army at the Allia River and subsequent sacking of Rome itself dealt a catastrophic blow to this expansion. Defenders remained on the Capitoline Hill, but the majority of the city was devastated. Legend has it that the citadel was spared because holy geese in the Temple of Juno alerted the Romans to an impending nighttime attack. After being offered a ransom of money, the Gauls finally retreated, but the horrific memory of this catastrophe would linger in Roman culture for decades. Amazingly, Rome recovered quickly from this disaster. Stronger walls were built, and the city was reconstructed. These kindred peoples were absorbed into Rome's expanding state when it vanquished the Latin League in a matter of decades. In order to create the tiered citizenship patterns that would later become a defining feature of Roman statecraft, certain Latin towns were granted full Roman citizenship, while others were granted only limited privileges. There were major political improvements throughout the Republic's middle years. By requiring one consul to be a plebeian, the Licinian Sextian rules allowed non-patricians to hold the highest position. Plebeians were granted access to all significant ecclesiastical and magistral positions throughout the ensuing decades. Although political opportunities were increasingly decided by money rather than birth, Rome was able to escape the damaging class battles that afflicted many Greek city-states because to this trend of social integration. Conflict with other regional rulers was an inevitable consequence of Rome's increasing strength. Rome expanded its dominion over the Italian peninsula from coast to coast by waging 3 bloody battles against the Samnites, mountain peoples of central Italy. Rome came across the well-developed Greek towns of Magna Graecia as it solidified its hold in central and southern Italy. The most powerful of them, Tarentum, requested assistance from Pyrrhus, king of Epirus in Greece, because it felt threatened by Roman expansion. Pyrrhus sent a powerful army, including war elephants that the Romans had never seen before, to Italy. Even though Pyrrhus defeated the Roman troops many times, he was so severely wounded that his soldiers were exhausted. Pyrrhus withdrew to Greece, following a failed war in Sicily, leaving the Greek towns to contend with Rome on their own. Rome seized control of the whole Italian peninsula south of the Po River shortly after Tarentum fell. Rome was remarkably wise in how it governed this nascent Italian confederacy. Rome permitted friends to keep local sovereignty while retaining strict control over military and foreign policy matters. Loyalty was encouraged by the expansion of legal rights and citizenship levels. Roman colonies were positioned all across the peninsula to serve two functions. They established key military positions and provided land rewards to veterans. Rome would have a significant edge in future confrontations because to this Italian alliance structure, which would provide it access to personnel resources that considerably exceeded those of any adversary in the Mediterranean region, a huge geographical state with centralized authority that was adaptable enough to take into account local variety. United Italy symbolized a geopolitical revolution in antiquity. Soon, Rome's focus shifted from Italy to Sicily, where the western part of the island was ruled by Carthage, a strong naval kingdom with its base in North Africa. Rome had to make a crucial decision when a group of Italian mercenaries known as the Mamertines asked for Roman defense against the Syracusans and Carthaginians in Sicily. War with Carthage, a naval force with centuries of maritime expertise that Rome lacked, would result from intervention. The First Punic War began when the Senate decided to grant the Mamertines' plea. Rome had to build its naval capabilities from the ground up as a result of this struggle. Following early setbacks, the Romans took control of a Carthaginian ship and modeled their own fleet after it. In order to enable Roman soldiers to employ their superior infantry abilities in naval battle, they outfitted these ships with a corvus or boarding bridge. Roman perseverance ultimately won out, even though they suffered terrible casualties in combat and storms. Carthage paid a large compensation to Rome in exchange for Sicily. Rome was more nearly destroyed during the Second Punic War than during any other fight since the Gallic assault. Hannibal Barca, a skilled Carthaginian leader, led an army from Spain into Italy, crossing the Alps using war elephants at the Trebia, River Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly Cannae, where an estimated 50,000 Romans died in a single day. He dealt 3 destructive losses to Roman troops. Rome refused not give up in face of these catastrophes. Rome created additional legions as Hannibal marched through Italy, winning over disgruntled Roman people, while a youthful commander called Scipio led the war to Spain and then Africa. The general, Quintus Fabius Maximus, used delaying tactics to avoid direct conflict. Hannibal was called back from Italy when he saw that Carthage itself was under danger. The conflict came to a conclusion when Scipio, now known as Africanus, beat Hannibal in the Battle of Zama. Carthage became a Roman vassal state after giving up its fleet, its foreign holdings, and its political independence. Rome became the dominating force in the Western Mediterranean after defeating Carthage. The Hellenistic kingdoms that had arisen from Alexander the Great's dominion attracted the Romans' interest as they moved eastward. King Philip V of Macedonia was vanquished by the Roman soldiers who also defeated Antiochus III of the Seleucids at Thermopylae and Magnesia. Under Roman rule, the former Macedonian monarchy was split up into 4 republics. In the same year that Carthage was completely destroyed in the Third Punic War, Greece itself came under direct Roman authority. Roman civilization was drastically altered by these conquests. The new provinces brought Italy enormous riches, which enriched both private citizens and the public coffers. Due to the abundance of seized slaves, modest farms in Italy were replaced by expansive estates that employed slave labor, altering the country's agricultural landscape. Rome experienced social unrest as a result of the large number of displaced rural residents that moved there. Originally intended for a tiny city-state, the Republican government system found it difficult to manage a sizable Mediterranean empire. Province-ruling governors frequently abused their authority for their own benefit. Generals who were successful had the allegiance of their soldiers, which may pose a danger to civilian government. As wealth and ambition grew, it appeared that the ancient ideals of selflessness, responsibility, and simplicity, known to the Romans as mos maiorum, or the way of the elders, were eroding. These modifications prepared the way for the Republic's turbulent last century. After being elected tribune, Tiberius Gracchus suggested allocating public lands to alleviate poverty in rural areas. Rich senators fiercely opposed his proposal, and as a result, he was assassinated, the first political killing in centuries in Rome. After suggesting more drastic changes, such as grain subsidies for city dwellers, his brother Gaius Gracchus suffered a same fate 10 years later. These incidents created political violence as a tactic in Roman politics and upended the ruling class's long-standing agreement. Ambitious generals like Marius and Sulla utilized their military might to meddle in political conflicts in the decades that followed. The first time a Roman general directed his army against the city itself was during Sulla's march on Rome. Following a brutal civil war in which he defeated his opponents, Sulla proclaimed himself dictator and carried out ruthless purges of his opponents by putting up prescription lists identifying those who would be executed and seizing their belongings. Despite Sulla's final retirement, his actions set a risky precedent. To control Roman politics, 3 strong men, Peter Crassus and Julius Caesar, formed an unofficial alliance known as the First Triumvirate. Caesar gained control of Gaul, where his valiant exploits overran contemporary France and briefly invaded Britain, bringing him fame, fortune, and military might never before seen. The Senate sided with Pompey in opposition to Caesar once the coalition broke up. Caesar was told to give up his leadership, but instead, he led his army across the Rubicon River, starting the Civil War with the well-known phrase, "The die is cast." Caesar, who became dictator of Rome after defeating Pompey's army, instituted a number of changes, including a new calendar. Republicans were frightened by his lifetime dictatorship and growing accolades because they believed he was aiming for monarchy. Conspirators under the leadership of Brutus and Cassius killed Caesar in the Senate House on the Ides of March. Caesar's assassination sparked a fresh civil war instead of bringing the Republic back. In order to find Caesar's murderers, his adoptive son, Octavian, joined Mark Antony and Lepidus as members of the Second Triumvirate. Following their victories against Brutus and Cassius at Philippi, the triumvirs split up the Roman realm. Tensions inevitably arose, especially between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east, where he sided with Queen Cleopatra VII of Egypt. The decisive battle took place at Actium when Agrippa's forces, led by Octavian, routed Antony and Cleopatra's united fleet. After fleeing to Egypt, the couple killed themselves there. Now, the only ruler of Rome's enormous lands, Octavian took care to avoid Caesar's errors. He maintained republican facades while amassing hitherto unheard of personal authority, calling himself princeps first citizen instead of king or dictator. The Republic came to an end, and the Roman Empire began when the Senate bestowed upon him the title of Augustus. The legacy of the Republic was complicated. In the end, its constitutional balance had failed to stop despotism and civil war. But throughout the course of its 5 centuries, Rome had grown from a little Italian city-state to become the dominant force in the Mediterranean. Under the emperors, republican institutions would persist in name and for millennia to come. Republican principles of liberty, civic responsibility, and constitutional governance would reverberate throughout Western political philosophy. Rome was at a turning point when Octavian addressed the Senate in January of what is now known as 27 BCE. After decades of civil strife, the Republic that had ruled for 5 centuries was in ruins. But instead of asserting absolute monarchy, Octavian engaged in a calculated political maneuver. Seemingly giving up the immense power he had amassed, he declared that the Senate and the people of Rome would once again hold the reins of control. He was given the name Augustus, which has religious connotations and suggests someone who is respected or sacred by the Senate, which was full of his admirers. In addition, they granted him a carefully crafted set of privileges, including the ability to veto decisions, leadership of important provinces where legions were stationed, and tribunician authority. Historians refer to this period as the founding of the Principate, a system in which Augustus maintained the appearance of republican governance while exercising previously unheard-of personal authority as first citizen rather than king. Over the course of his 41-year reign, Augustus established trends that would characterize Roman imperial government for generations to come. He settled veterans in the provinces and colonies around Italy after reducing the army from 60 legions to 28. He developed a permanent police force in Rome, changed the tax code, started a postal service, and recruited firefighting cohorts. His construction endeavors completely changed the capital. In fact, he famously claimed to have turned Rome from a brick city to a marble metropolis. Augustus protected and extended Roman borders in international affairs. While the empire's border in the Rhine was established by negotiation with the Parthian Empire, Germanic tribes were forced back beyond that line. After decades of opposition, Spain was ultimately subdued, and the Danube became the northern European limit of Rome. Most importantly, Augustus established a stable succession system, something the Republic had failed to do in its latter decades. Since he had no son, he steadily pushed his stepson Tiberius to the top, guaranteeing a seamless succession after his passing. Tiberius established the Julio-Claudians, a dynasty that would rule Rome for more than 50 years. Tiberius was a skilled general, but a hesitant ruler. After withdrawing to the island of Capri and handing over state affairs to the aspirational Praetorian prefect Sejanus, his formerly prosperous reign took a turn for the worse. When Tiberius discovered Sejanus's scheme to take over, he began a series of treason trials that terrified the Roman nobility. Caligula, Tiberius's grandnephew, succeeded him, but his initial promise turned into seeming insanity. His execution, after only 4 years of power, indicates how unpopular he was with the Roman aristocracy. Despite the inflated tales of his excesses, brutality, and strange behavior, including intentions to install his horse as a consul. Claudius was then crowned emperor by the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's domestic army. Claudius proved to be a capable administrator in spite of his physical limitations, which had caused his family to ignore him. He enlarged the empire during his 13-year rule by capturing Britain and adding additional eastern provinces. Recognizing that regional integration, not Italian dominance, was the way of the future for Rome, he also expanded citizenship and allowed the Gauls to join the Senate. Nero, who started his rule with promise under the leadership of the Praetorian prefect Burrus and the philosopher Seneca, brought an end to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. However, his authority became oppressive as he consolidated his independence. Following the Great Fire of Rome, he persecuted Christians, kicked his pregnant wife to death, and had his mother Agrippina assassinated. Revolts followed Nero's increasing unpopularity, and he is said to have moaned, "What an artist dies in me," before taking his own life. The year of 4 emperors was a period of upheaval brought on by Nero's death. Generals Galba Otho and Vitellius all seized the throne in short succession, but each was deposed by a military uprising. Ultimately, the Flavian dynasty was established when Vespasian, who commanded the Eastern legions, triumphed. Vespasian's 10-year rule restored stability to the empire. He restored budgetary prudence following Nero's excesses. He was a man of modest beginnings, with a pragmatic attitude to governing. His most notable contribution to architecture was the start of the Flavian amphitheater, sometimes called the Colosseum, which was constructed as a gift to the Roman populace on the location of Nero's lavish house. Titus, his eldest son, succeeded him just months before Pompeii and Herculaneum were destroyed by Mount Vesuvius's eruption. When Titus passed away after just 2 years in power, he was deeply remembered for his compassionate handling of this and other calamities, such as a fire in Rome. Domitian was the last Flavian emperor, and during his 15 years in power, there was a great deal of military activity in Britain and along the Danube border. Although he was a good administrator, the Senate didn't like his authoritarian ways. The Flavian dynasty ended with his murder. Nerva, an old senator, was then chosen by the Senate to be emperor. Nerva chose the well-liked commander Trajan as his successor, since he had no biological heir and no military backing, starting a pattern of adoptive succession that would successfully serve Rome for almost a century. The first non-Italian emperor was Trajan, who was born in Spain. During his 19-year rule, the Roman Empire expanded to its largest size. He included Dacia's gold mines into the empire after conquering what is now approximately Romania. In his most ambitious war, he temporarily extended Roman power to the Persian Gulf by annexing Armenia, Mesopotamia, and portions of Parthia. These eastern victories were the pinnacle of Roman expansion, even if his successor would relinquish parts of them. Trajan was praised for his domestic reforms in addition to his military prowess. Among his many construction projects were projects in the provinces and a huge forum in Rome. Even later, Romans viewed him as the ideal emperor to compare others to, and he founded the Alimenta, a charity program that supported impoverished youngsters in Italy. Trajan may have adopted his relative Hadrian on his deathbed, while others believed Hadrian's friends had staged the adoption. In any case, Hadrian changed imperial policy as soon as he was crowned emperor. He withdrew from Trajan's eastern conquests and concentrated on stabilization rather than growth, after realizing that the empire had reached its finite boundaries. Over half of Hadrian's 21-year rule was spent touring the provinces, frequently accompanying his troops on foot as they examined frontier defenses. He commanded the building of a huge wall across the island's small northern waste in Britain, forming a barrier against barbarian assaults that is still partially in place today. In lieu of further development, comparable frontier works were reinforced around the empire, drawing distinct borders. Hadrian, a Greek culture enthusiast, who in contrast to his clean-shaven forebears, sported a beard in the Hellenic style, spent a great deal of time in Athens, finishing the enormous temple of Olympian Zeus that had been started centuries before. The Pantheon, a monument to Roman technical genius that still stands today with its groundbreaking concrete dome, was part of his architectural legacy in Rome. For 23 extraordinarily tranquil years, Antoninus Pius Hadrian's chosen successor governed. The empire flourished during his rule since there were no significant conflicts or internal unrest. Antoninus chose Marcus Aurelius as his heir, carrying on the custom of adoption, but with the stipulation that Marcus take Lucius Verus as a co-emperor. Despite being a devout Stoic philosopher whose writings are still read today, Marcus Aurelius realized that military difficulties dominated his rule. Germanic tribes started to push against Roman borders on the Danube in larger numbers than before, perhaps as a result of population shifts further west in Europe and Asia. At first, Marcus and Lucius shared power, but after Lucius's passing, Marcus was left in charge alone amid more challenging circumstances. A terrible virus known as the Antonine Plague, possibly smallpox, brought back by soldiers from Eastern operations, posed a greater threat to the empire than outside enemies. Perhaps 5 million people died from this illness across Roman territory, undermining the country's military and economy at a crucial time. Marcus Aurelius preserved the borders in spite of these difficulties, and before his passing, he even had plans to establish new provinces outside the Danube. Marcus permitted his biological son, Commodus, to succeed him, which would have disastrous effects for Rome, in contrast to his predecessors, who selected the best candidate for the position through adoption. The Roman Empire was at its height during this 2-century period, which spanned Augustus to Marcus Aurelius. Under the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, a huge network of roads spanning more than 250,000 miles allowed for trade communication and military mobility throughout the Mediterranean basin and beyond, allowing the population to reach about 70 million people living in relative security. Cities thrived with public facilities not found in previous eras, such as theaters, forums, public baths, and aqueducts carrying fresh water. 3 continents were governed by Roman law, which was becoming more complex and compassionate. During this time, art and literature also flourished. The epic poem of Virgil the Aeneid, Ovid's Metamorphoses, Tacitus's Chronicles, Suetonius' biographies, and Pliny the Younger's letters were all written during this time period. Practical knowledge in areas like construction engineering, agriculture, and medicine made daily living more comfortable for Romans than for any big people before them, even while scientific advancements trailed behind literary triumphs. Most notably, Christianity was born during this time and began to expand. Despite intermittent persecution, the new religion gradually expanded across the empire during the time of Tiberius, when Jesus of Nazareth lived and died. Most major towns had Christian communities during Marcus Aurelius's reign, setting the groundwork for later advances that would revolutionize the empire. The prominence of the provinces grew during the early empire as well, as rulers from Spain and other countries adopted the Purple Italy, lost its advantageous position. Over the course of several generations, citizenship was progressively expanded to include all free residents of the empire. Trade networks linked far-flung areas with commodities entering Roman marketplaces from as far away as China and India. A number of pillars supported this extraordinary period of stability and prosperity. The Augustan settlement struck a compromise between respect for tradition and imperial authority. The adoption process that resulted in a number of competent leaders. Boundaries that are sufficiently safe to thwart significant incursions, and an economy that produced enough surplus to sustain a standing army of over 400,000 men and urban civilization, even though it was limited by today's standards. No one could have predicted that this golden period would come to an end when Marcus Aurelius breathed his last breath on the Danubian boundary. Commodus's ascension would signal the start of problems that would put the imperial system's tenacity to the test in ways its founders could not have predicted. However, the accomplishments of the early empire would reverberate throughout the ages, establishing a model of harmony, wealth, and responsible leadership that would motivate societies long after Rome had collapsed. With Marcus Aurelius's death, Commodus took the purple and the Roman Empire's heyday started to fade. Commodus was not particularly interested in the responsibilities of government, in contrast to his father, who was a philosopher. He was athletic and handsome, and he liked the gladiatorial arena better than the council room. He frequently participated in fictitious battles, charging the imperial treasury astronomical fees for his appearances and bragging of thousands of wins against rivals who dared not challenge him. The machinery of empire continued to run, thanks to the efforts of seasoned bureaucrats, but Commodus indulged his fancies by renaming Rome Colonia Commodiana and portraying himself as the reincarnation of Hercules. However, an atmosphere of dread was fostered by his arbitrary murders of senators and officials. His wrestling partner Narcissus strangled him in his bath on the last day of the year, as part of a scheme involving his inner circle, who thought they would be the next to suffer his wrath. The Senate installed the honorable General Pertinax on the throne following the murder of Commodus. His attempts to bring order back to the Praetorian Guard ended in disaster. When he refused to give them a special incentive after only 3 months, they killed him. The most disgraceful incident in Roman history may have followed. The empire was practically put up for sale by the Praetorians. This questionable distinction went to a rich senator named Didius Julianus. However, he was only in power for 66 days. Disgusted by what had happened in Rome, provincial armies nominated their own leaders for the position of emperor. Septimius Severus, the leader of the Pannonian armies, rose from this turmoil, marched on Rome, dissolved the discredited Praetorians, and founded a new dynasty. A skilled warrior, Severus established his position by combining military triumphs with the merciless destruction of opponents. He spoke Latin with an accent and was the first emperor from North Africa, having been born in Leptis Magna. Roman governance underwent substantial changes under his rule, most notably the administration's growing militarization and its increased dependence on equestrians for important positions rather than senators. Severus established the new province of Mesopotamia, with its fertile farmlands during his 18-year reign by waging successful operations against the Parthian Empire in the east. In addition, he went to Britain to combat against the Caledonians in Scotland and fortify Hadrian's Wall. He is said to have advised his sons to enrich the troops and despise everyone else before passing away at the northern outpost of Eboracum, which is now York. Caracalla and Gaeta were supposed to govern together, but they couldn't since they hated each other. Caracalla erased Gaeta from official records and monuments within a year by ordering a damnatio memoriae and having his brother killed in their mother's arms. After that, Caracalla started a reign of terror on those who supported his brother. Notwithstanding his brutality, Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, one of the most important decrees in Roman history, which granted Roman citizenship to all free men in the city. This decree, which was partly driven by a desire to raise tax revenue, formalized Rome's transition from a city-state to a universal empire where citizenship was determined by the law rather than ethnicity. As on a campaign in the east, Caracalla was killed by a soldier who stabbed him as he was using the restroom on a road. The extraordinary women of the family, especially Julia Maesa, Septimius Severus's sister-in-law, who facilitated the ascent of her grandsons Elagabalus and Alexander Severus, were essential in the continuation of the Severan dynasty through a succession of emperors, in an effort to elevate this religion above conventional Roman worship. Elagabalus sparked a controversy in Rome with his devout devotion to the Eastern Sun, the god whose name he carried. He further alienated conventional Romans with his claimed effeminacy, which included rumors that he married a male charioteer. 4 years later, he was killed by the Praetorians, who then disposed of his remains in the Tiber. Alexander Severus, who was just 13 when he took the throne, was governed by his mother, Julia Mamaea. Despite growing military difficulties, his 13-year rule sought to mend fences with the Senate and restore traditional values. The Sassanids, a new Persian dynasty that had supplanted the Parthians, were a more formidable foe in the east. Germanic tribes, meanwhile, put further strain on the borders of the Rhine and Danube. Alexander's men rebelled and declared Maximinus Thrax, a huge former shepherd from Thrace emperor, when he chose to negotiate with Germanic tribes instead of attacking them. A soldier from a lowly background with no education or elegance, Maximinus symbolized a new kind of emperor who ascended solely on the basis of his military prowess. Despite being a successful general, he was extremely unpopular with citizens due to his high taxes to finance military operations. Desperate to regain power, the Senate backed an uprising in Africa headed by the old governor Gordian and his son. The Senate named Pupienus and Balbinus, two of its own members, as co-emperors after they were swiftly overthrown. When Maximinus marched on Italy, his own soldiers invaded Aquileia and killed him. The 13-year-old Gordian III, the grandson of the previous claimant, was elevated by the Praetorian Guard, who promptly assassinated the Senate's appointees. Historians refer to this dizzying succession of emperors and usurpers as the crisis of the 3rd century. At least 26 persons held the title of emperor throughout the ensuing decades, the majority of whom ruled for only a few years before dying violently. As the imperial office turned into the winner of an unending catastrophic military lottery, the Roman world appeared to be coming apart. The internal turmoil was exacerbated by external threats. Decius, the first Roman emperor to lose a war against foreign foes, and his son perished in the Battle of Abritus while battling Goths. An even worse fate befell the Emperor Valerian, who was taken alive by Shapur IV of the Sassanid Persian dynasty and purportedly used as a human footstool before being skinned and stuffed as a trophy after his death. The empire started to fall apart as the central government collapsed. Under a series of regional kings, a Gallic empire that included Gaul Britain and portions of Spain broke out in the west. Provinces from Egypt to Asia Minor were ruled by Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, a desert trading center in the east. Political collapse was coupled by an economic catastrophe as a result of the currency's frequent devaluation to fund the troops, which led to extreme inflation. Rome's 1,000-year history appeared to be coming to a close. However, even during this most dire time, strong institutions and competent people came to the rescue to save the empire. Claudius II and Gothicus's ascension marked a sea change. He was known as Gothicus because during his brief 2-year rule, he forcefully repulsed Gothic invaders in the Balkans. Even though he passed away from the disease Aurelian, who was praised by his soldiers after Claudius's death, carried on his task. Aurelian was crowned restorer of the world for his 5-year rule. Queen Zenobia was sent to Rome in golden chains as a tribute to his victory over the Palmyrene Empire. He then brought the empire back together by regaining the Gallic regions that had broken away. He constructed a huge new wall circuit that is still partially intact today to defend Rome from barbarian attacks. He created an official sun worship and changed the currency in an effort to promote religious harmony. Aurelian's accomplishments were in danger of being undone by his assassination, which was motivated by a secretary's false allegation that the emperor intended to put numerous officers to death. Carus founded a short-lived dynasty after a succession of short-lived rulers. Although murder is still a possibility, Carus is said to have perished when lightning hit his tent during a victorious campaign against Persia. While returning from the Persian expedition, his praetorian prefect Aper killed his son, Numerian. The officers in attendance at Numerian's burial crowned Diocletian, a lowly Dalmatian cavalry captain emperor. In order to fulfill a prophecy that Aper would become emperor after slaying the boar, Diocletian personally killed him right away. In Latin, Aper. The time of instability came to a conclusion with the accession of Diocletian. The empire was radically changed, but it had endured. Gone was the ancient Augustan Principate, with its delicate balancing act between imperial power and republican forms. It was replaced by a more blatantly authoritarian regime in which the emperor was no longer seen as the head of state, but rather as a distant, holy person. All facets of administration were now controlled by military requirements. In order to combat various border threats, the army had almost doubled in strength and was using an increasing amount of the state's resources. To fund these forces, taxes have become more standardized and more substantial. With the entire empire bearing comparable obligations, the division between Italy and the provinces had all but disappeared. However, significant cultural advancements persisted in spite of the anguish of the 3rd century crisis. Neoplatonism emerged at this time thanks to thinkers like Plotinus, whose mystical understanding of reality had a significant impact on Christian philosophy later on. Christianity itself gained popularity throughout these turbulent decades by providing a sense of community and spiritual comfort during these unsettling times. Once a persecuted minority, the faith was now a powerful influence in Roman society, with jurists like Ulpian and Papinian, honing legal theories that would impact societies long after Rome fell. Roman law continued to develop. Roman engineering still created amazing feats, from the walls of Aurelian to public structures across the provinces, in spite of economic hardships. The empire that Diocletian inherited was damaged, but not destroyed, by the end of the 3rd century. The upcoming changes would fundamentally alter Rome's political structure and establish a new imperial structure that could adapt to the demands of a changing global environment. After being forged in the furnace of crisis and recovery, the shift from the early empire of Augustus to the late Roman world was accomplished. The Roman world was worn out after a half-century of crises when Diocletian stood triumphant after obtaining the purple. More drastically than anybody since Augustus, the new emperor would transform imperial rule by learning from this chaos. Diocletian had ascended via military service without the advantage of aristocratic ties, having come from a modest family in Dalmatia on the Adriatic coast. He could have been able to perceive Rome's structural issues more clearly because of this outsider's viewpoint. The empire had become too big and complicated for one emperor to run efficiently. Just when problems sprang out on one border, military situations on another frequently called for the emperor's attendance. Diocletian made the extraordinary decision to name a co-emperor in recognition of this fact. While Diocletian concentrated on the east, he promoted his fellow officer, Maximian, to the position of Augustus and gave him command of the western provinces. Since this divide was inadequate, Diocletian appointed 2 Caesars, or junior emperors, Galerius in the east and Constantius Chlorus in the west, substantially enlarging the imperial college. The tetrarchy, sometimes referred to as the Rule of 4, was a system that maintained the appearance of a single empire while dividing administrative duties. Rome itself lost its center position, and each tetrarch ruled over a fourth of Roman territory from his own capital city. A succession plan was part of the deal. The senior Augusti would retire after 20 years, giving the Caesars the opportunity to choose new junior colleagues and elevate existing ones. The goal of this system was to avoid the succession issues that had afflicted the 3rd century. Diocletian restructured the administrative geography of the empire. In addition to the imperial leadership, the number of provinces was almost doubled, but they were made more manageable by being divided into smaller divisions. These regions were arranged into 12 dioceses, which were then divided into 4 prefectures, one for each tetrarch. Multiple levels of control were established by this system, with the goal of lowering corruption and increasing efficiency. The military was restructured similarly, whereas provincial governors had historically blended civil and military authority. Diocletian distinguished between the two. To combat several border threats at once, he significantly expanded the army's size. He lowered the size of regional armies and established a central mobile reserve capable of responding to emergencies in order to curtail the authority of possibly dissident generals. More resources were needed to support these enlarged military and administrative systems. To determine taxable wealth and persons, Diocletian conducted a thorough census. His new tax system, which gathered a fixed amount of production and merchandise from each region, demanded payment in kind instead of increasingly worthless money. In order to guarantee the continuation of critical services, Diocletian required boys to pursue their father's skills and required some vital professions to be hereditary. Although the empire was stable as a result of these changes, the state's influence over people's lives was greatly expanded. The early empire's free market economy was replaced by a more regulated one where the demands of the state were prioritized above those of the private sector. As differing legal norms were applied to the higher and lower strata, the division between honestiores and humiliores intensified. With his decree on maximum prices, which established price caps for hundreds of commodities and services across the empire, Diocletian also sought to alleviate economic instability. Despite its good intentions, this legislation was eventually abandoned because it was impractical to police. Diocletian first shown tolerance in issues of religion before beginning what is now known as the Great Persecution against Christians. This last and most extreme attempt to stifle Christianity involved the killing of clergy members, the destruction of Scripture, and its seizure. Persecution, albeit severe, differed by area and did not stop the spread of Christianity. In accordance with his succession plan, Diocletian made the extraordinary decision to retire on his own volition, forcing his fellow Augustus Maximian to follow suit. He allegedly told guests that only a former emperor could appreciate the delights of retirement as he spent his last years growing cabbages at his palace on the Dalmatian coast of Split. Nearly immediately after its designer retired, the meticulously planned tetrarchic system fell apart. Troops declared Constantine, son of Constantius Chlorus, and Maxentius, son of Maximian emperors, undermining the succession plans due to dynastic feeling. In the next years, several claims engaged in intricate power battles for domination. The winner of these battles was Constantine. Christian history states that Constantine received a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign conquer," prior to the pivotal battle of the Milvian Bridge against Maxentius. Constantine's adoption of Christianity would revolutionize the Roman world regardless of whether it was driven by sincere conversion or political expediency. Together with his eastern colleague Licinius, he issued the Edict of Milan, which officially put a stop to the persecution of Christians and returned the property that had been taken from them. The edict gave Christianity legal standing and imperial favor, but it did not declare it the state religion. Later, Constantine overthrew Licinius to establish himself as the only ruler of the reunified realm. The establishment of a new capital on the location of the Greek city Byzantium was arguably Constantine's most important choice. As committed as Constantinople, it controlled the strait between Europe and Asia and held an unmatched strategic position. For more than a millennium, this new Christian city, free from the pagan connotations of Rome, would be the capital of the empire. Constantine softened the harshest parts of Diocletian's administrative reforms while keeping many of them in place. After decades of inflation, Alexander introduced monetary stability with the solidus, a new gold currency that held its value for generations. Without outright banning traditional worship, his religious policies favored Christians, starting a slow but steady shift that would quicken under his successors. Constantine's three surviving sons. Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans inherited the empire after his death. Fratricidal warfare and ongoing religious tensions, especially in relation to the Arian dispute over Christ's divinity, characterized their regimes. The only emperor, Constantius II, ruled until his passing. The final significant attempt to re-establish ancient Roman religion occurred under the short reign of Constantine's nephew, Julian the Apostate. During his 18-month reign, Julian, who was raised as a Christian but had secretly converted to pagan religion, aimed to restore classical culture and curtail Christian privileges. This religious counter-revolution came to an end when he was killed in battle against the Persians. The favored status of Christianity was upheld by the emperors who succeeded Julian. Christianity was become the official state religion under Theodosius III. Following the Edict of Thessalonica, which declared Nicene Christianity to be the only accepted religion in the empire, pagan temples were shut down and customary sacrifices were outlawed. The ancient religious customs that had kept Rome afloat since its inception had now been formally abandoned. Beyond theological issues, Theodosius had to deal with serious outside obstacles. The Gothic troops had annihilated his predecessor Valens at Adrianople, possibly destroying 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army and killing Valens himself. The increasing military danger presented by Germanic peoples vying for territory inside the empire was illustrated by this fight. Instead of trying to drive these Goths out, Theodosius incorporated them into imperial territory as federati allied armies that recognized Roman rule and served under their own commanders. This practical strategy boosted the dominance of semi-autonomous Germanic populations within Roman frontiers while providing the necessary workforce. In addition to aggressively recruiting Germanic peoples for regular troops, the late Roman military depended more and more on these allied contingents. It is simplistic to say that aristocratic Romans hired barbarians to fight their wars. Many barbarians were fully Romanized, while many Romans continued to serve. However, the ethnic makeup of the army was very different from previous centuries. This time period's social and economic changes mirrored the empire's metamorphosis. By prioritizing heavenly salvation above traditional civic qualities, Christianity altered societal ideals. As great agricultural estates and imperial service took center stage in economic life, the urban middle classes began to erode, as its classical monuments were either transformed to Christian usage or cannibalized for building materials. Cities shrunk under defensive walls. Nevertheless, notable cultural accomplishments persisted despite these shifts, as Christian intellectuals like Ambrose Jerome and Augustine created complex theological and philosophical frameworks that would shape Western thinking for centuries. Patristic writing flourished throughout this time. Theodosian law maintained Roman jurisprudence for future generations by compiling imperial laws into a systematic legal reference. Theodosius's sons Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west split the empire after his death. This split would turn out to be permanent, even if it was just transitory in theory. Despite preserving the appearance of a one empire, the eastern and western courts progressively pursued divergent goals and dealt with distinct difficulties. Although its inhabitants continued to identify as Romans, the eastern half, which was wealthier and physically more protected, would survive for another millennium as what contemporary historians refer to as the Byzantine Empire. Within a single lifetime, the western half would disintegrate due to existential issues. The emperor now reigned as an Oriental-style king referred to as dominus instead of princeps, and the changed Roman state by the end of the 4th century resembled the principate of Augustus very little, as the royal presence became more isolated behind ornate court rituals. Officials bowed before it. Traditional religion had been supplanted by Christianity, which changed basic beliefs about human nature and society. The fundamental continuity of Roman government persisted despite all of these modifications. Approximately the same areas that were ruled by the Antonines were still under the empire's jurisdiction. Greek and Latin continued to be the official languages. Everyday life was still governed by Roman law. Despite the fact that the definition of Roman identity changed as conditions changed, citizens continued to identify as Romans. The protracted drama of the Western Empire was finally about to come to a close. The obstacles facing the Western emperors would eventually prove overwhelming as internal resources diminished and Germanic pressure on the frontiers mounted. While the eastern half adapted and lasted, direct Roman power in the West would disappear in the next century. Between the sons of Theodosius, the Roman world was split at the start of the 5th century. Arcadius in Constantinople and Honorius in Milan oversaw ever more distinct domains, even though they were officially part of a unified empire. Strong advisors Stilicho in the west and Rufinus in the east were crucial to the success of both young emperors. At the exact period that Rome faced its worst foreign assault, the ensuing court intrigues would erode imperial power. The Huns' invasion from the Eurasian steppes served as the impetus for the impending catastrophe. Unprecedented numbers of Germanic peoples were driven against and eventually beyond the Roman boundaries by their westward movement. The Goths posed the greatest threat right away because they banded together under the ambitious new ruler, Alaric, following the death of their leader, Fritigern. After their triumph at Adrianople, Alaric's Goths had become foederati inside the empire and felt abused by the ruling class. They rebelled and started traveling around the Balkans, alternating between negotiating with and threatening the imperial courts in the east and the west when their requests for better conditions were rejected. Stilicho, who was partially Vandal in heritage but firmly Roman in culture and allegiance, used both military might and diplomacy to counter the Gothic menace. But distrust from both imperial courts, which feared he was trying to take over the entire empire, hampered his attempts. The Western Empire lost its most skilled defender when Stilicho was executed on treason accusations. Now that Stilicho was gone, Alaric recognized his chance. He invaded Italy and succeeded in sacking Rome, something that had not been done in 8 centuries. The psychological toll on the Roman world was enormous, even though the Goths were only in the city for 3 days, and the destruction was mostly restricted. Writing from Bethlehem, Jerome bemoaned the fact that the world's great light had been extinguished and that everyone had died in one place. Soon after the sack, Alaric died, and the Goths fled to Gaul before settling as Roman federates in Aquitaine. In the meantime, during a particularly severe winter, additional Germanic peoples had poured into Gaul and then Spain after crossing the frozen Rhine. These included the Alans Vandals and Suaves, who created their own lands inside ostensibly Roman provinces. In response to these repeated attacks, the Western imperial authority, which had relocated to Ravenna for more protection than Rome, found it difficult. More and more, the ultimate military leader, the master of warriors, had actual authority instead of the emperor. Flavius Aetius, commonly referred to, be the last of the Romans occupied that role for over 20 years. A new danger arose in North Africa, as Aetius sought to preserve what was left of Roman rule in Gaul. The opulent regions that had long provided Rome with grain were subjugated by the Vandals, led by their ruler, Gaiseric, who went from Spain to Africa. They created a strong empire and a fleet that would rule the western Mediterranean by conquering Carthage. Attila the Hun, the Western Empire's most formidable foe, was emerging as these Germanic colonies within the empire took shape. Attila went west and invaded Gaul after decimating imperial soldiers and ravaging the eastern provinces. At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, Aetius assembled a coalition of Germanic federates and Roman soldiers, including Visigoths, to fight the Hunnic army. Attila's assault in Gaul was stopped by this frantic resistance. Attila attacked Italy the next year, before an embassy headed by Pope Leo III managed to convince the Hun to leave Rome appeared to be doomed. Although subsequent narratives would ascribe this to supernatural intervention, Attila's army's illness, the famine in devastated Italy, and maybe bribery from Constantinople were practical reasons. Rome saw a temporary reprieve when Attila died soon after this campaign, and Hunnic control fell. However, that same year, Aetius was murdered on the orders of Emperor Valentinian III due to court intrigue, and months later, Aetius's adherents assassinated the emperor, bringing an end to the Theodosian dynasty in the West. A swift line of short-lived emperors, many of whom were only puppets of strong military leaders, came next. The final significant attempt to re-establish Roman authority in the West was made by Majorian, who ruled for only a few years. His defeat and death marked the end of his attempts to restore the troops and retake North Africa from the Vandals. Following Majorian, several Germanic kingdoms successfully established their independence in previous territories, meaning that Western emperors ruled over just Italy. The Visigoths grew their empire from Aquitaine, while the Suebes ruled the northwest of Spain. The Franks progressively grew in dominance in the north of Gaul, while the Burgundians dominated the southeast. Britain had established its own post-Roman society, heavily impacted by Saxon invaders after being deserted by imperial soldiers decades before. The majority of the former provinces no longer cared for the Western emperors by the latter decades of the 5th century. The military leader, Ricimer, had actual authority in Italy, as did his successors, Gundobad and Orestes, following his death. Romulus was a little kid when Orestes made him emperor, but he had no real power. Similar to federates in other provinces, Germanic troops in Italy, primarily from the Syrian and Herulian tribes, wanted permanent land concessions. They supported Odoacer, a German commander in Roman service, when Orestes refused. The pretense of imperial power in the West came to an end when Odoacer toppled Romulus and ousted Orestes. Odoacer handed the imperial regalia to ruler Zeno in Constantinople as a practical solution, indicating that there was no need for a separate Western ruler. He applied for and was granted the title of patrician, thereby ruling Italy as an independent monarch, but serving as Zeno's viceroy in name. Unexpectedly kindly Romulus, who was still a teenager at the time, was allowed to retire to a country estate with a substantial pension. The fall of Rome, or more precisely, the end of the Western Roman Empire, is widely seen as having occurred around this time. However, there was no abrupt collapse for those who experienced these experiences. Under the new administration, much of the Roman living systems persisted. Germanic rulers frequently used Roman bureaucrats, maintained some kind of tax system, and enacted laws modeled by Roman ones. The Western Empire was unable to endure the stresses that its Eastern counterparts were able to successfully manage for a number of reasons. Invasion was more common, and land borders were more exposed in the West. Even in better times, its economy had been more rural and less urbanized than the East's. A cycle of diminishing resources resulted from the loss of the prosperous North African provinces and portions of Gaul that had supported Western finances to Vandals and Visigoths. When compared to their Eastern counterparts, Western emperors likewise experienced a lack of legitimacy. Trust in imperial power was eroded by the frequent civil wars and quick succession of rulers. The psychological underpinning of empire, the conviction that Rome will always exist, was seriously harmed in the West following the fall of Rome. However, Romanitas, or Roman culture, and identity persisted even as direct imperial power diminished. Latin continued to be the literacy and administrative language. Roman legal principles and organizational frameworks were maintained by the Catholic Church. Even as new Germanic rulers reigned from old imperial palaces, people continued to congregate in forums and aqueducts continued to transport water. The Roman world did not end with the fall of the Western Empire. From its splendid capital at Constantinople, the empire flourished throughout the East, including the lost Western provinces that they aspired to reclaim in the future. The Emperor Zeno and his successors believed they were the rightful rulers of the whole Roman world. Odoacer's reign would be short-lived in Italy. Theodoric, the Ostrogoth ruler, was given permission by Emperor Zeno to invade Italy and overthrow Odoacer. Theodoric's kingdom, which reflected one of the most effective fusions of Roman and Germanic components in the post-imperial West, was founded after he defeated and ultimately killed his adversary. The concept of Rome continued to hold a strong hold on people's imaginations as the Western provinces started to gradually change into what would eventually become medieval Europe. Germanic rulers desired Roman titles and Constantinople's approval. The administrative void created by imperial withdrawal was increasingly filled by the Church. The Roman Empire, which is now Greek-speaking and Christian, but still identifies as Roman, carried on the traditions of Augustus and Constantine far to the east. Therefore, rather than a catastrophic collapse, the fall of the Western Roman Empire represents a pivotal moment in a much longer process of change. In the West, the governmental system established by Augustus 5 centuries before had finally collapsed. However, Roman culture would continue to flow through new channels in the upcoming medieval world, much like a large river splitting around a barrier. The Eastern Roman Empire flourished as the Western one vanished into history. This surviving realm's inhabitants never referred to themselves as Byzantines, a designation coined by contemporary historians. In their increasingly Greek tongue, they proudly identified as Romans Romaioi, the legitimate heirs of Constantine and Caesar. The heritage of Rome would be preserved and changed by this Eastern Roman Empire for about 1,000 years, following the overthrow of Romulus Augustulus. By the end of the 5th century, Emperor Zeno was confronted with formidable obstacles. While his Saurian countrymen from Zeno's mountainous region controlled the court and caused discontent among the populace of Constantinople, religious disputes over the character of Christ split Eastern Christians. With competent administration, effective tax collection, and military security, that the divided West could only aspire to the empire managed to survive. Anastasius, Zeno's successor, ruled effectively for 27 years. His building of the Great Walls shielded Constantinople's landward approaches, and his prudent financial management restored the treasury. Despite ongoing theological conflicts, Anastasius preserved the empire's standing against its long-standing eastern adversary, Sassanid Persia. With Justinian Furi's accession, the Eastern Roman Empire entered its golden age. Justinian was born into a family of Latin-speaking peasants in the Balkan provinces, and he married the remarkable Theodora, whose transformation from a dubious actress to an imperial consort shocked conservative circles, but brought a cunning and resolute partner to the throne. The restoration of imperial unity was Justinian's ultimate goal. To rid North Africa of the Vandals, he sent his superb general, Belisarius. Belisarius completed this task with amazing efficiency and quickness, restoring imperial rule over the fertile grain-producing area. This victory gave Justinian the confidence to launch an invasion of Ostrogothic Italy. The Italian campaign was far more challenging. What started off as a quick reconquest turned into a 20-year conflict that left the peninsula in ruins. The final Gothic resistance was routed, and Ravenna was taken by imperial forces, but the cost was high. Once the center of Roman power, Italy was now economically destroyed. Even though parts of Spain were reclaimed, Justinian's goal of restoring the entire western region was never realized. Imperial resources, which were already under stress from the war with Persia, were further taxed by these military operations. When the bubonic plague swept over the Mediterranean basin and killed maybe 40% of Constantinople's population, the situation deteriorated. The budgetary issues that would befall Justinian's successors were brought on by this demographic disaster, which decreased tax income and military recruitment. Despite these difficulties, Justinian's rule saw several noteworthy accomplishments. With its groundbreaking 108-foot dome, the beautiful church of Hagia Sophia continues to be one of the architectural wonders of the world. The Corpus Juris Civilis, a thorough reorganization and collection of Roman law that maintained ancient legal concepts for future generations, was much more durable. One of Rome's most important contributions to the contemporary world is its legal code, which would later serve as the foundation for numerous European legal systems. The empire went through a challenging time following Justinian's passing. While the battle with Persia depleted resources, his successor Justin II lost a large portion of Italy to the Lombards. Tiberius the Legate and Maurice the succeeding emperors grappled with dwindling finances while maintaining imperial fortifications. Maurice was overthrown and executed by the usurper Phocas as a result of his efforts to reform the military. The empire faced previously unheard-of difficulties in the 7th century. Massive invasions were carried out by Persia under Shah Khosrow VI, which resulted in the conquest of Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and a large portion of Anatolia. The most revered of Christian artifacts, the genuine cross, was sent as a prize to the Persian capital when Jerusalem fell. Opposite Constantinople, Persian soldiers arrived at the Bosporus. One of Rome's greatest rulers rose to power at this time of extreme distress. The imperial counterattack was personally directed by Heraclius, who had deposed the despot Phocas. He forced a settlement that restored the genuine cross and all lost provinces by driving deep into Persian territory in a series of spectacular wars. This spectacular reversal seemed to permanently secure the eastern boundary of Rome. However, a fresh force was forming in the Arabian desert, while Heraclius rejoiced in his victory. Inspired by the new faith of Islam and united by the Prophet Muhammad, Arab armies quickly exploded into Persian and Roman territory. Roman armies were soundly defeated at the Battle of Yarmouk, and the weary Persian Empire fell completely. Syria, Palestine, and Egypt provinces that had been Roman for more than 6 centuries were ruled by Islam within 10 years. The empire was changed by this devastating loss of land. With Constantinople as its heart, the rest of the kingdom grew smaller. The southern Balkans and western Asia Minor. Latin was finally superseded by Greek as the official language of government, and the empire became more overtly Christian. Though contemporaries did not see this separation, modern historians frequently identify this change in the 7th century as the shift from the Eastern Roman to the Byzantine Empire. The empire adjusted and endured in spite of these enormous territory losses. Constant Arab attacks were effectively stopped by the theme system, which reorganized provinces into military districts where soldier farmers protected their own farms. Imperial ships had a significant edge in defending Constantinople thanks to Greek fire, a mystery incendiary weapon that could burn even on water. Constantinople's strong fortifications held both times when Arab troops besieged the city itself. A major turning point was reached when both sieges failed, protecting most of Europe from Islamic invasion and maintaining the empire as a Christian stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. The iconoclastic period, which spanned the 8th and early 9th centuries, was characterized by disputes over sacred iconography. Icon worship was outlawed by emperors ranging from Leo III to Theophilus because they believed it to be too similar to idolatry. Relations with Rome and other Western Christians who still used sacred images were strained as a result of this stance, which also split society. These rifts were reconciled, and a time of intellectual and cultural renewal was brought about by the restoration of icons. The empire recovered its power after Basil I's establishment of the Macedonian dynasty. Cities were revitalized, military fortunes improved, and agricultural output rose, while Basil Sen gained the nickname Bulgar Slayer for his brutal battles that brought all of the Balkans under imperial control. Emperors like as Nikephoros Phocas and John Zimisces reclaimed territory in Syria. Despite being Greek in language and culture, this resurgent Rome was the most advanced, affluent, and powerful civilization in the Christian world. With a population of maybe 500,000, Constantinople was far larger than the little cities of Western Europe. Its cathedrals shone with mosaics. Its academics kept old manuscripts unheard in the West, and its marketplaces offered items from as far away as China and Scandinavia. However, below this gilded exterior, fundamental flaws were emerging. As aristocratic estates grew, the free peasantry that had been as the foundation of the theme armies rapidly lost land. Instead of being determined by merit, civil service jobs became more and more inherited. Christianity became split into Catholic and Orthodox branches as a result of growing religious conflicts with the Latin West. The decisive event occurred at Manzikert, where the Seljuk Turks overthrew Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes and allowed Turkish settlers to settle in Anatolia, the empire's heartland. Concurrently, Pechenegs stormed over the Danube, and Normans overran Italy's last imperial domains. The empire, which had appeared victorious only decades before, was now struggling for existence. The First Crusade was partly sparked by Emperor Alexios Komnenos' frantic plea for Western assistance. Greek and Latin rivalries were more acrimonious, even if crusaders did create nations in the Holy Land. Due to the Fourth Crusade's notorious detour to Constantinople, the world's largest Christian metropolis was sacked, and a brief Latin kingdom was founded on its ruins. Under Michael VIII, Palaiologos imperial armies were able to retake Constantinople, but the reconstructed empire was only a ghost of what it had been. While Serbian and Bulgarian nations carved out Balkan territory, its economy was controlled by Italian merchant republics. Most significantly, the majority of Anatolia was under the hands of Turkish emirates, with the Ottoman state's aggressiveness being the biggest danger. After entering Europe, the Ottoman Turks progressively surrounded Constantinople. Desperate diplomatic attempts to obtain Western assistance were unsuccessful. When the final siege started in April, Emperor Constantine XI had just a few thousand defenders against Sultan Mehmed II's enormous Ottoman force. The old walls of Constantinople resisted Ottoman cannon fire for 7 weeks. The last attack was launched on May 29th. According to legend, Constantine XI abandoned his imperial garb and perished in battle with his troops as the city collapsed. On that same day, Mehmed rode to Hagia Sophia, which was converted into a mosque. After 480 years of existence, after Augustus's accession, the Roman Empire came to an end. However, its legacy persisted in a variety of ways. The Ottoman sultans, who ruled over a large portion of the old Byzantine realm, referred to themselves as Caesars of Rome. Moscow maintained imperial customs and genuine Christianity while claiming the mantle of the Third Rome. Classical literature, saved by Byzantine experts who fled west before and after the fall of Constantinople, were rediscovered by Renaissance Italy. The Byzantine Empire was above all the vital link between the ancient and medieval civilizations. It kept early Christian doctrine, Greek philosophy, and Roman law alive for centuries when they may have been lost otherwise. Its complex economy, sophisticated administration, and intricate diplomacy served as examples for nations well beyond its boundaries. Finally, the great tale that started with Romulus on the Palatine Hill was over. However, Rome never really fell. It changed. As you go off to sleep, consider how the rules we abide by, the languages we use, the structures we love, and innumerable other facets of our world would be very different without Rome's lasting influence. Rome's influence endures to this day, even though the last emperor to hold the title of Caesar fell with Constantinople in 1453. Let's consider the lasting impact of this amazing civilization, which influenced our globe in many ways as you go closer to sleep. Rome's contributions to law and government are arguably the most important. In order to meet the intricate requirements of a multicultural society, the Romans created a sophisticated legal system that went beyond the constrained parameters of previous laws. Roman fingerprints may be seen in ideas we take for granted, such as the presumption of innocence, the significance of purpose in criminal conduct, and the division between civil and criminal law. These ideas were upheld throughout the Middle Ages and until the present by Justinian's monumental legal collection, the Corpus Juris Civilis. This Roman legacy was a major influence on the legal systems of European countries in the late medieval and early modern eras. Roman models are the direct ancestors of the civil law system that currently controls the majority of continental Europe, Latin America, and portions of Africa and Asia. Many Roman ideas were also incorporated into the common law traditions of England and its former colonies, despite their unique development. Beyond particular law clauses, Rome established innovative public administration techniques that will impact succeeding nations. The Romans established sophisticated taxation, regulated weights and measures, a professional civil service, systematic record-keeping, and frequent censuses. Despite their seemingly unremarkable nature, these inventions created the fundamental framework that made sophisticated societies possible. Roman custom is largely responsible for the concept of citizenship itself, which is a formal legal position that bestows rights and obligations. By gradually granting citizenship to conquered peoples, Rome provided a route to integration that contributed to the empire's long-term viability. Despite its flaws, this earned inclusion paradigm offered a substitute for the rigid ethnic exclusivity that defined many ancient republics. Rome's influence is still unavoidable in the fields of language and literature. For more than 1,000 years, Latin, the language of the peasant farmers along the banks of the Tiber, became the dominant language of Western society. Nearly 1 billion people today speak the Romance languages, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian, which are descended from Latin, but are no longer spoken as their primary language. Due to centuries of borrowing, Latin has influenced even languages that are not directly inherited from it. Despite having a Germanic foundation, English borrows over 60% of its lexicon from Latin, either straight or via French. Latin continues to be the primary source of scientific, legal, and technical terminology worldwide, offering a common language that transcends linguistic barriers. Western literary heritage would find resonance in the forms and ideas created by Roman writing. The epic Aeneid by Virgil served as a model for writers such as Dante and Milton. Shakespeare and numerous other authors were influenced by Ovid's creative legendary tales in the Metamorphoses. Seneca's plays and philosophical writings influenced Renaissance drama, while Cicero's eloquence served as templates for political oratory. Our understanding of the intent and techniques of these genres has been influenced by Pliny's letters and Tacitus's chronicles. Rome's physical heritage is still quite stunning. Roman engineers created an unparalleled infrastructural network that changed the Mediterranean environment. Many Roman roads still serve as the foundation for contemporary highways, with their meticulously designed routes continuing to function well, even with current technology. Roman engineers constructed aqueducts that provided water to Spanish cities like Segovia far into the 20th century. Buildings of scale and durability that were previously unthinkable were made feasible by Roman architectural breakthroughs, especially their refining of the arch vault and dome. Their invention of concrete made it possible to build structures that have withstood earthquakes, floods, and war for 2 millennia. One of the greatest architectural wonders in the world, the Pantheon in Rome, inspired structures from the Renaissance to the present with its flawless dome and sky-open oculus. Rome left behind an equally significant legacy in military matters. The legion served as a model for armed forces for generations to come. It was a versatile professional combat force that combined heavy infantry with specialist troops. Roman forces established the norm for succeeding successful armies by emphasizing discipline, training, engineering, and logistics above sheer bravery or numbers. Caesar's campaigns are still studied by military colleges today as models of tactical and strategic genius. The image painted by Rome's political heritage is more nuanced. The authors of many contemporary constitutions, especially the founders of the United States, were influenced by the Republic's checks and balances, separation of powers, and term limitations. However, Rome also showed how ambitious people may undermine Republican institutions and how freedom could be exchanged for stability and security. In a similar vein, the imperial system that succeeded the Republic taught subsequent generations both good and bad lessons. At its height, the Roman Empire offered prosperous, secure, and well-run administration to a wide range of people on 3 continents. In its worst form, it illustrated the perils of authoritarianism, the corrupting of absolute authority, and the difficulties in preserving unity across large geographic and cultural divides. The Roman environment in which Christianity evolved is responsible for its globalization as the most popular religion in the world. To spread their message early, Christians made use of Roman highway ships and urban networks. Following Constantine's conversion, ecclesiastical organization was modeled after the imperial governmental structure, with dioceses frequently matching Roman province borders. The popes who preside over the Catholic Church even acquired the title of Pontifex Maximus, which was formerly held by Roman emperors as the head priest of the official religion. Rome's aptitude for synthesis and transmission was just as important to its cultural success as its unique contributions. By often adopting Greek models, Roman scientists, philosophers, and artists maintained and passed on Greek accomplishments to succeeding civilizations. A large portion of ancient Greek thinking may have been lost to the Western heritage if Rome hadn't acted as a bridge. Long after the fall of the empire, the concept of Rome itself became a potent emblem. Political leaders aspired to assume the Roman mantle during the medieval and early modern eras. Rome's powerful symbolic heritage is shown in Charlemagne's coronation as Roman emperor in 800, the Byzantine ruler's identification as Romaioi, the Russian Tsar's claims to be the successors of the Third Rome and the Habsburg Holy Roman Empire. The enduring, if occasionally abused, potency of Roman symbolism is demonstrated by the deliberate evocation of Roman imperial grandeur in Mussolini's fascist iconography and Nazi building. The cosmopolitan vision that Rome left behind for succeeding civilizations, the notion that many peoples may engage in a common cultural and political community while preserving elements of their own identities, may be the most important legacy that Rome left behind. This Roman ideal of a world united by law and common citizenship, rather than separated by ethnic or religious barriers, is still a potent goal in our own more interconnected global society, despite its uneven realization in practice. Rome also showed the depths to which mankind may go and the heights to which it can ascend. The excesses of Caligula were part of the same culture that gave rise to Marcus Aurelius's wisdom. The vicious gladiatorial contests were also held by the same group that constructed the Pantheon. This nuanced legacy serves as a reminder that human accomplishments are often accompanied by human shortcomings, and that civilization is inherently both admirable and imperfect. As you go off to sleep, consider how our world might be different if Rome hadn't had such a lasting impact. Without the Roman experience, our legal and linguistic systems, our engineering and architecture, our political structures, and our religious organizations would all undergo significant changes. Rome has influenced how we view ourselves and our society, from little things like the names of our months to important issues like citizenship and government. From Romulus to the fall of Constantinople, the Roman tale spans over 2 millennia and provides a vast epic of human achievement, adaptability, and resiliency. The Roman world changed through ups and downs, victories, and setbacks, but it never lost ties to its history. The empire's shadow persisted in influencing everything that came after it ended as a political entity. Take solace in this continuity of human experience as you fall asleep. We are illuminated by the same stars that bathed Augustus when he converted brick Rome to marble. We are still driven by the same human aspirations, anxieties, and fantasies that drove the Romans to seek safety, wealth, purpose, and beauty. Perhaps Rome's greatest legacy of all is found in that common humanity,